So welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this afternoon's double session on affordability. We are going to have this in a two-part session. So the first hour is going to be domestically focused. Second hour is going to be sort of expanding the aperture a little bit and looking at the international context for affordability. And maybe a little bit of logistics first. Well, actually, I'll just go ahead and just introduce myself. So my name is Steve Capana. I am Policy Director here at the Crux Alliance. For those of you who don't know, the Crux Alliance is a network of think tanks and sectoral experts that work in the 20 largest emitting countries around the world on policy development and implementation, really trying to be that trusted resource for government officials and source of really detailed technical information that can be used to craft and implement ambitious climate policy. In the context of climate policy, that's why we're talking about affordability today, where affordability has become sort of a real watchword recently. It's become a real high priority for a number of people and therefore policymakers, both in the United States and around the world. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today is how affordability affects, influences our ability to achieve some of the climate targets that we have and to implement the climate targets that have already been put in place. I will start by saying that if we're going to be using Slido today to ask questions, and we also are going to actually start with a poll. So there is actually a QR code in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there that maybe you can see from far away. If you can scan your phone, go there. Otherwise, you can also go to slido.com and then enter the word affordability. First question, the only question for this session is going to be what you think the major driver of affordability, of electric energy price increases today is, and we're going to sort of come back to that question in a little bit. But I will just say that one of the drivers here is the energy price increases that we have seen over the last several years. Energy prices have outpaced inflation for the last 3 or 4 years. Just over the last year, electricity prices, for instance, nationwide have gone up by between 6 and 7%, and that's higher in some places, including the Northeast, right here in New York. And so this is having real impact. And so to talk about that is this esteemed panel, who I will introduce now, and then look forward to hearing how they are considering affordability in their jobs today. So first, Chair Rory Christian is the Chair and CEO of the New York Public Service Commission. He has started his career as a civil engineer in the energy sector before transitioning to government as the Director of Energy Finance and Sustainability for the New York City Housing Authority, and more recently as Director of New York Clean Energy at Environmental Defense Fund before becoming Chair of the Public Service Commission. Welcome, Chair Christian. Damali Harding is the Executive Managing Director of Amendment 9 Strategic Consulting. She brings 2 decades of leadership across clean energy, utility transformation, regulatory strategy, equitable decarbonization, and has worked at Oracle, O-Power, NextEra Energy Resources, Deloitte, and most recently the Regulatory Assistance Project, where she recently served as the Director of Global Strategic Initiatives. And Rachel Moncrief is the Executive Director of ICCT, the International Council on Clean Transportation, where she's a chemical engineer by training, has more than 20 years of experience, and has served many roles at ICCT over the years, including overseeing ICCT's heavy-duty vehicles and compliance and enforcement programs. So maybe I'll start by asking a question to the entire panel. So as you heard, sort of the premise of this panel is that affordability is an increasingly important issue if you want to work on climate and decarbonization. So maybe I'll just ask, first of all, do we have that right? Is that true? And if so, how is that influencing your day-to-day life and your day-to-day work? How is that being part of your job? Maybe Chair Christian, we'll start with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Louder? I'll just think. Good afternoon, everyone. That better? Great. So again, Rory Christian, Chair of the Public Service Commission, CEO of the Department of Public Service. Those are actually 2 distinct roles. I won't bore you with the details, but affordability is an integral part of everything that we at the Commission do. It's actually built into our mandate, the provision of just and reasonable rates for utility services. Here's the thing about just and reasonable. It does not mean it's affordable to all. And I can cite dozens of studies that talk about the rate of energy growth costs over time, not keeping up with inflation, how energy costs may actually be lower than what they were 30 years ago by a per capita basis. And I can follow those up with studies that show income have remained flat and not grow. And so what we're seeing is a combination of factors, not just one, but two and several other factors contributing to an environment where the felt experience is energy costs are going up. So I just want to start us off on that point. Now, in terms of affordability being a major consideration, and it's built into the very processes that my commission and every other commission goes through in doing rate cases. Most people hear about a rate case, they hear their rates went up 5%, 4%. That's the end result of what's been a months-long process that started with an initial offer that could be 10, 15%. And had the commission, myself or any other commission in the country, not engaged in that process, the utility would have gotten exactly what they originally asked for. So affordability not only is something that's part of our mandate, but it's built into the very processes through which rates are set to try to get them as low as possible. And what we mean by that is we need to make infrastructure investments. I'm looking at the screen over here. I'm seeing increased demand. I'm seeing maintenance, better efficiency, renewable energy. All of these things are contributing factors. But in my mind, one of the biggest contributing factors is the fact that our system's old. In New York, the system's 100 years old, the electric system itself. We have the distinction of having the first power generator here in New York City, and a lot of the infrastructure built since then, we're using the same tunnels, the same routes in many instances. We're replacing 100-year-old equipment today, and that's something we're going to continue doing. And that means you're going to pay more. Whatever standards were in place 100 years ago have changed a lot. The costs are higher, and now you have the compounding fact of higher inflation, rising interest rates, we have the supply chain disruptions, COVID-19. All of these are contributing to higher cost. So affordability is something we pay very careful attention to. It's built into our mandate, and we've executed on a number of different programs to try to highlight and reinforce the need for that at the consumer level, which I assume we're going to be talking about in more detail later.
Did we are, thank you. Damali, do you want to?
Yeah, so can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so I actually hate the word affordable right now. And the reason why is that when you use that in the general public, they presume that means that your utility bill is going to be lowered. And as part of the requirement for us to get to the transition, that's not a factor, right? Like all of these things are influencing that. And so one of the things that we have to think about, and actually New York State just did this, is how do you make affordable mean ability to pay? And thinking about that, not just in terms of energy cost, housing costs are going up, inflation is going up. And so thinking about what are the different mechanisms and levers that you have to allow people to be able to pay their utility bill on time comfortably without making life outcome changing choices. And so thinking about that longer term, how do we do that? So how do we allow for greater efficiency of the grid and all of the work that needs to happen, and use that to create air conditioning for people in the summertime, right? How do we allow for that to happen in light of what's happening with Y-heat? And so the one-time payment that might have gotten somebody through a winter is no longer available. So what does that mean for the system? And so when we think about affordability, right now there's a lot of noise in the system. So when I look at this, I actually think this is what's happening now. What policies do we need to shape and have affordability for 2030, for 2035? Because at that point, all of the AI load growth would have shaken out. We will continue to have supply chain challenges. We will continue to have challenges in wholesale market, right? We're seeing a lot of challenges. I live in PJM territory. I have had people who've never known what PJM was come up to me and say, what is this thing that is causing my energy bill to spike, right? And so a lot of these challenges are working out, but one of the things we really have to focus on is what do we need to implement today so that long-term affordability and long-term life outcomes are improved for people.
That's great. We should have asked you first before you named the panel on affordability. Rachel.
Great, and thank you so much for having me. And this is a really good conversation to be having right now. I think I'm the person on the panel representing transportation. So I'm going to kind of come at this affordability with the transportation angle. For many households in the United States, I believe the majority, transportation's the second largest expense next to housing. And so this is not typically an optional expense. And of course, for lower income folks, it's a much higher percentage of their monthly expenses. So we have to make transportation affordable. When we look at electrification vehicles, to me, electrification is actually synonymous with affordability. Electric vehicles are, if not today, they will be in the next few years more affordable to purchase, to own, to operate across the spectrum from, you know, the 2 and 3 wheelers, the cars, the trucks, the buses, all of it. So it's either happening today or it's going to be happening. So that's what we're focused on. How do we get those costs to come down faster so that we can have more affordable electric vehicles for people, and specifically focusing on policies that are going to really help the lower income groups. So looking at the used EV market and how can we accelerate that. When there's fiscal incentives, how can we make sure that they're going to the people that need it the most? How can we make sure that manufacturers are offering lower cost range of models available? So those are the kinds of things that we're focusing on at ICCT when it comes to affordability.
That's great. I think that your answers collectively teed up a lot of great things we can cover in the next 45 minutes or so. Look, we've referenced the Slido results. It does look like increased demand. Data centers are sort of the biggest ones right now. There's also data center demand, so that seems to be a theme. Looking at this, though, it's a very diverse group of things that are up there. A lot of people have a lot of ideas, even this presumably very well-informed, very good-looking audience. There's still a lot of confusion or a lot of disagreement about what's driving. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you think is driving price increases or the people's feeling of price increases. And actually, I think that thinking about that in both the short and long term would be great. Thinking about the short-term drivers and sort of what the long-term trajectory is as far as what should we be doing to counter those main drivers. Maybe we'll start with you, Molly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of this in there, right? So specifically thinking about volatile weather patterns, thinking about, you know, if you ever have read a utility rate case, I mean, just the cost alone for what they need for transformers, right? I think the transformer wait now for just maintenance of the system that we have is up to 4 years. And so when you start to think about the cost that's needed, when you start to think about education, workforce development costs, when you start to think about all of those things, and then starting to think, as you indicated, Chair Christian, around the system that we have was implemented 100 years ago. And so how do we take data that we have, like we have so much data on, you know, my utility can tell I am gone, right? Because the usage pattern looks different. How do you use that to create different products? How do you use that to change how a utility can operate more efficiently? But it takes a lot of creativity, both from the utility, from the regulator, and from the what I'll call the sphere around the utility, right? So earlier today, I was at a finance summit, and a lot of the companies that they're investing in are trying to use either AI or trying to use demand flexibility, trying to build VPPs in a different way to take advantage of all these things, but they still need to come back to the utility because ultimately it winds up being that's the mechanism you have. And so increased demand, again, there's a lot of noise right now around that and around how real that is. And again, I like to use a future reference point because in 2030, when the winners and losers have shaken out, are we just preloading future demand from growth from population, from EVs? Are we just building out infrastructure we would have built out anyway? And so I don't think there's any one lever. I think there's some levers that we need to think about from a policy perspective and maybe putting some guardrails around. I think that's the way I would kind of frame it up around what do we need to, we can't just have everybody running out unfettered like they did in the Wild Wild West more than 100 years ago, but what are those levers and how can the policy structure support that?
Great, Rachel?
Sure. So, yeah, I appreciate the question because it's, what's causing the rate increases right now, but then also what can we look towards in the future? And I think those are definitely two different questions, at least in my view. My understanding, and I'm actually not the expert probably on the panel on grid costs and everything like that, but the main costs that go into the cost today, it's the generation, the transmission, and the distribution. And from everything I've seen in the data that's available right now, it's really they're replacing, all of the distribution that's aging, natural disasters, ironically, caused from climate change in a lot of cases. And that's what probably is causing the increases that we're seeing today. Now, we know moving forward there's going to be a lot of new demand. New demand does not necessarily have to mean increased costs. In fact, when we looked at electric vehicles, we actually think electric vehicles, if done well, can put downward pressure on costs. But this is going to, we're talking about a transition here. So we have like you said, 100 years of a mindset of let's not grow. And let's instead be more efficient. And now we're actually, no, we need to grow, but we need to grow in a planned way. And I think that's where it's good to have these conversations and learn from the experts on this, though. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, maybe, Chair Christian, I'll make the question a little more pointed for you, which is just that in New York, obviously, given aging infrastructure, there are a lot of investments you need to make. Given increased demand, you have to find increased supply that needs to be built as well. And at the same time, balancing that with keeping costs low and meeting New York's pretty ambitious climate targets as well. Yeah, how do you do that?
It's easy.
Oh, good.
No.
Thank you very much, everybody.
It's actually an incredibly hard challenge, and for anyone who's ever remodeled a home or redecorated or changed anything in motion, it's hard to do something different while doing the thing you've always done. People often use the analogy, you're fixing the airplane while you're flying it. Well, we are reskinning the airplane, changing the engines, putting in new pilots, changing out all the passengers, and changing the direction of flight all at the same time, and we have to do it cheaply with limited budget. So all of that is happening, and it's an immense challenge. And I want to point something out to everybody. We're talking about this in the context of a transition. And I'm curious, does anyone in the audience know what real energy transition happened where we stopped using one source of fuel completely? Can anyone think of one? And before you answer, I know no one can think of one because there's only one. It's whale oil. No one buys whale oil. There's no whale oil market, and that's the result of electrification, kerosene, and a few other things. But that is the single thing that we've been able to completely transition off of as a fuel. We still burn wood. If you have a wood-burning fireplace, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So we have to deal with the legacy of the infrastructure that we've built and manage that through this process. Further point, when we were building out much of the infrastructure that we have, the interstate gas transmission system, much of that is a World War II vintage era thing. It was originally built for getting oil to fuel battleships on the East Coast. Now we're using it for natural gas. Much of the electric infrastructure as it was built out, 1940s, 50s, 60s, these things need to be replaced. It was a lot cheaper to build major transmission in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, before OSHA existed, before we had environmental regulations, before people were required to be paid a minimum wage. We have a lot of rules in place now because of a lot of the things we did in the past weren't all that good. And we're trying to correct those mistakes, and there's cost. So now we have to replace this equipment. If you have a car from the 1980s, you've probably replaced it by now. Well, I've seen transformers from the 1950s and 60s today still operational, and they'll likely run another 10 or 15 years. We need to upgrade the system. It's going to cost more. And this is by far the single greatest contributor to cost. So the challenge when we talk about the transition, we know we have a gas system. We regulate that. We have an electric system. We also regulate that. One of my predecessors, and I'm going to try to quote her as best as I can, made it abundantly clear. We will need to replace 2 energy systems over the next 30 years if we continue with the status quo, both the gas and the electric system. If we make the electric system more robust, we only need to replace 1 if we're able to transition off of gas in an orderly manner. And that's one of the prime goals that we are trying to do. And there are going to be challenges, there are going to be roadblocks along the way, but directionally that's what we're trying to do. And if we're successful, overall affordability will materialize in the fact that you don't have to pay for gas.
I'm a little surprised to hear that there's not like an artisanal whale oil shop somewhere in Brooklyn.
I actually Googled this, and no, there's not a single one anywhere. The market's gone. Yeah, completely.
Totally gone. I do think that, like you said, the principal driver is aging infrastructure that we need to replace. I think maybe not in this room, but in the public at large, there's a sense that some of this, maybe a lot of this, is being caused by the clean transition, right? By renewable energy, but that electric vehicles are too expensive, that for energy efficient appliances. It feels like a communications challenge as much as anything else to make people understand why the prices are what they are. So do you have any thoughts about how we can, change the narrative on this to some extent? Maybe Rachel, I'll start with you.
Sure. And we know that's completely ridiculous. It's not true. But it is basically like everything we have to deal with in the environmental topic, we are working against a very sophisticated, very well-funded opposition who puts out a lot of misinformation, and it's up to us to try to counteract that. And it's challenging. I mean, we spend a huge amount of time trying to think from ICCT, we're a small nonprofit, but what can we do to contribute to this? So it's not just a one-size-fits-all solution, but you have to figure out what the community can do. From our perspective, what we've been doing is really increasing our communications capabilities. We have a lot of technical information. We have a lot of expertise at the ICCT. We need to be able to put those messages out so that they're readable and understandable by everyone. So actually, this is just a little plug, but we do have a page on our website that's called Clearing the Air. And it addresses all of these different misinformation about electric vehicles that are out there in a very clear way. And when we get requests from, let's say, mainstream media or different things that are hearing some of this misinformation out there, we can direct them there, and it makes that information accessible. That is a very small piece of the solution, I'll grant you, but that's our contribution right now.
Any other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I actually, this is one of my soapboxes, so I'm going to try to keep this very brief. So one is that's a great example around EVs, is that you need to make an emotional connection, right? Like, our industry wants people to come and make decisions based on facts. EVs run faster, cheaper. That's not how they do it. So, for example, my husband and I were watching Jay Leno's show on cars, and they had the sexiest EV that they designed, like this Italian company designed. We wanted one, right? Mm-hmm. Let's change the narrative around, instead of making it just logical based, because people are making emotions. Like, we saw the backlash to gas stoves was people said, but I cooked with my grandmother at this stove, right? Let's change that narrative to create the emotional connection to EVs are sexy, right? Have you been in a BYD, right? If you have not, go, they're amazing. Let's create a narrative around education. So when we're thinking about, for example, affordability, most people don't know what it takes for a light to come on, but let's give them a little more education around, hey, there's grid infrastructure, and here are the things that you can do in your home that you have control over to improve, again, for your life, your family. Make those decisions yourself so people take interest and take ownership of it, while still maintaining, we don't have to lie, but we want to create, instead of it just being like, here are the facts and you should make those facts, let's start to say, you're using this to cool your house, you're using this to charge your phone so that your kids can FaceTime with their grandparents across the country. You are charging an EV, and now if something happens, like telling the stories around, hey, you can run your refrigerator too on this for 3 days. I know people who, after hurricanes, bought EVs specifically for that. And so, again, come off the soapbox, but just a little bit of education and really creating narratives around the emotional connection that energy provides in our lives.
That's great. Yeah. I think it really helps that the technologies are getting better now too. When I started in this space about 20 years ago, we had to pretend that CFLs were good, and so now LEDs actually are good. It's great. But Chair Christian.
I hate to follow them, Ollie, because that was perfect in every way, and she knows it. And the key here, I think, underlying all of this is public education and awareness. And this is sadly where we are, I think, is a byproduct of the success of the system. You get a bill, you pay it, it's portable, you don't think about it. I'm willing to bet money if I asked how many kilowatts of electricity demand did your house draw last month, nobody could answer that question. I'm also willing to bet nobody can tell me how many kilowatt hours. How many of you can tell the difference between a kilowatt and a kilowatt hour, right? The level of education in the general population is such that most people can't answer or don't understand those concepts. And frankly, many of the people in my space who communicate these issues are lawyers or engineers. And no offense to any lawyers or engineers in the room, I am an engineer. We don't really communicate things all that well. So from a commission standpoint, we're taking efforts to try to better communicate this information in a natural English way, absent all the jargon, in a way so people can understand what the impact is going to be. And so when we talk about energy, we talk about it in terms of dollars and cents, bottom line impact on your bill. Everybody likes to save a buck, guaranteed. To do that, one of the things we're doing, we released a report recently highlighting all of our efforts in support of the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA. It's fresh off the presses, and it highlights the costs that most people will be paying for the various CLCPA initiatives. Now, one of the things we've heard, one of the misinformation that's been spread is the reason your rates are going up is the CLCPA. And this report proves that not to be the case. It's contributing the rates, but what's really contributing is the fact that we're replacing 100-year-old pieces of infrastructure. And the cost to do that is way more than the original cost to put it in. And so that's the biggest driver. And by doing these other investments, not only do we add additional benefits to the grid in terms of capabilities, but we create options for consumers. Wouldn't you like to get paid to have your car sit in your driveway? I'm not even going to tell you what I'm going to do with your car. Just plug it in. I'll pay you $10 a day. We have services like that are quickly becoming available where something that's an idle resource can provide you a benefit. You don't have to do anything. And that is the wave of the future. And we call it flexibility, demand flexibility. Putting in EVs, battery storage, solar, rooftop wind, whatever you want to do. Those resources in your home, in your vehicle, help the grid and you get paid for it. That's the market we at the Commission are trying to create to get more people involved and bridge this divide of understanding.
So I want to talk a little bit more about demand flexibility in just a minute. But first, maybe I should say that before I joined Crux, I was at the Department of Energy, where one of the things I did was work on tax credit implementation. And I'd be remiss to not note that a bunch of those tax credits that were in the Inflation Reduction Act have now been repealed or will be rolled back, repealed sooner than they otherwise would have been, or will expire sooner than they would have been. Most urgently, the electric vehicle tax credit expires next week. This was a big driver of some of the growth that we've seen in EVs. Same thing is true for many home energy technologies. And it also is a driver for the electric grid as far as driving down costs for wind and solar and other clean technologies. So how do we maintain momentum with clean energy deployment in the absence of that those really important demand mechanisms or incentives?
Yeah. That was not ideal that happened. Yeah, I agree. So what we know about electric vehicles is they are a better technology. Hitting that purchase price parity is so key. We can take some lessons from other markets. Norway, the reason Norway's at like 90+% sales of EVs is because they put in place tax incentives to get to purchase price parity sooner. China is at 50%, almost 50% sales of EVs, and I know you have an international panel, but I'm just looking at what we can learn. Right now, I think about over half the models in China have surpassed purchase price parity, and that's without any incentives at this point. So we know that getting past that threshold is going to be so key to accelerating this transition. So now we don't have this tax credit to rely on anymore. So now what are we going to do? How are we going to get there faster? And of course, we're looking to the states. I think that's really the main option we've got there. We have a lot of leadership in California. California has something along the lines of 20 or 25% sales, I believe, compared to the US, which is 10. So they know how to do incentives. There's a number of states that want to work with California and that want to follow them. And, the governor has said he wants to stay on track with the same goals he had. Of course, they're not going to probably be able to match that exact incentive, but there's many other things that you can do besides just a big tax credit. There's many other things you can do to sort of incentivize and drive down costs. And that's what we're working on there.
So we too, like California and other states, recognize the value of an incentive and helping. And the state has a variety of incentives for vehicle ownership. But also what we find more important than the cars themselves is the charging stations. If you're going to buy an EV, the last thing you want to do is, where's my charging station? What am I going to do? We provide incentives that will allow a charging company to deploy a public charging station and cover 95% of the costs. That's new substations, new transformers, new feeders, all the bells and whistles to get it ready to accept that first vehicle, 95% of the cost. And this is a program we call the Make Ready EV program that we've deployed in New York to great success. We're deploying thousands of EV chargers throughout the New York Thruway and throughout the rest of the state. But in addition to charging, we and the city of New York in particular have worked together to deploy a number of programs in niche markets. If you've taken an Uber or a Lyft lately, you've probably noticed it's likely a Tesla of some kind. That's not an accident. The city of New York gave much more liberal terms to taxi drivers driving EVs than internal combustion vehicles. So not a direct incentive per se, but definitely a nudge in the right direction that many people took advantage of. So there's lots of different things we can do to structure this. You're going to see a lot more EV charging spots for free charging on public roads. Literally, park your EV or charge for free. And you're going to see a lot of other things coming. But we definitely recognize the value of incentives to get to the next level of adoption.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody here was at RE Plus 2 weeks ago. And so I think the energy of that room is 40,000 people all focused on clean energy development. And so that sign of what's happening. So the greatest thing here was increased demand. The fastest way to meet that is through clean energy development. And that's just a fact. And so by virtue of the needs of the tech companies, I quite frankly am glad that they are putting a lot of pressure on this continuation of development of renewables because they need that power tomorrow, right? Like somebody whispered to me that at an event here, Google said, yeah, we need 2,500 megawatts by the end of 2026. Well, waving a magic wand, the easiest way, the only way physically to get there, even waving a magic wand for gas plants, right? So if you're following what's been happening in the South and certain utility is trying to put forth gas plants, at best, with no environmental regulations, assuming you could get all the parts, assuming you could get the construction crews, you are still 3 years out before anything comes. And that's highly unrealistic, right? And so just the market forces will empower renewables. And so I think you're going to start to see a lot of the changes dissipate or not be as enforced because of that, because you're going to have the marketplace pushing down.
Interesting. A reminder to everybody, I think we're going to probably turn to audience Q&A in maybe 10 minutes or so. So if you have any questions, make sure to put it in on Slido. We've talked a little bit about demand flexibility already, but maybe returning to that topic. I've spent my fair share of time looking at sort of 100% clean scenarios, net zero scenarios in the electricity sector, and they make some awfully heroic assumptions about what the electricity supply can look like, how much we can build, how much transmission we can build, and there seems to be less of a focus on how demand can change. We sort of take as a given that demand is going to be the same today as it is tomorrow, but there's a lot of exciting things happening on demand flexibility, and that could happen if we change some of the incentive structure or incentives. You started talking about this a little bit, Chair Christian. Maybe see if you have anything else to expand on here?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of different things to help expand the market for flexibility. One of which, if you have time to Google the Brattle Group, we commissioned them to generate a report highlighting what is the potential for load flexibility. And this is what's out there, what's possible. If we got every kilowatt we could, what's the potential? And they calculated at 8 gigawatts. 8 gigawatts, that's 8,000 megawatts of potential load flexibility. Now, this is significant. In New York, we peak out at around 32, 33 gigawatts. So that's a big chunk of load that we could use to benefit the health and well-being of the grid. The question is, how do we harness it, right? Damali talked about how people are buying EVs after storms, putting in battery storage. These are lots of disparate investments people are utilizing a lot of different ways. How do we let them know about market mechanisms that allow them to connect to the grid and get paid, right? Because at the end of the day, nobody knows how many kilowatts or kilowatt hours, but you know what your bill was when it was too high, and you probably don't want to pay it every month. And you'd rather not pay it at all. So how do we create an environment where that becomes a possibility? And load flexibility is one such pathway. So one of the things we at the Commission did in setting up a market structure, we want to make sure people know the value of their resource, right? If you were to think of 100 watts of solar in downstate New York versus upstate New York, I think it's safe to say it's far more valuable in downstate New York and New York City than it would be in upstate. Well, that's one of the many things that we've taken into consideration. Location, performance, when it operates, how it functions, and how many kilowatts it can produce. And we've structured a new incentive mechanism known as VDER, Value of Distributed Energy Resources. Remember, engineers, lawyers, they're the ones naming all this stuff, right? But this new platform is the future of how we're going to compensate people. If I can tell you exactly how much value your solar, your EV, your batteries are providing in Long Island versus someone in Westchester or White Plains or wherever, then we can deliver the right market signals at the right time for people to do what we need them to do to benefit the grid.
I'll expand on that because I actually just had a conversation this morning also about kind of C&I and the demand flexibility question as well, right? And so I think there's naturally, we think a lot about residential demand, and I think your point, Chair Christian, around it just needs to be seamless and painless, right? People don't want to actually have to think about, do I turn my EV on now? Like if I plug it in and I leave it and I get a check, that's amazing. But I think there's a really wonderful opportunity at the industrial level because they are such large energy users, and these are real savings for them and also real reliability, right? So when we talk about even industrial electrification, one of the challenges that comes up consistently is the reliability question because they can't afford to go out for 4 hours because something happened. And so understanding that, and I think one of the other policy drivers is that right now is so disparate around what goes, who regulates what, is it behind the meter, in front of the meter, who's interconnected where, how is it interconnected, who gets to set the tariff structure. And so I think putting some, like, the one challenge I have is where I wish there was national leadership is kind of putting together either some best practices or really thinking about models that different states could follow or pinpoint, because not everybody is as well resourced as New York or California or Massachusetts. And so a lot of these questions are coming up, and you have the investors who are ready and lining up, but there's just not really robust policy structures where they can take on that challenge to say, okay, well, we can operate here, but we may want to even expand that further.
Yeah, Rachel.
Yeah, and I think we've been sort of talking around the topic of when it comes to electric vehicles, smart charging, or vehicle to grid, V2G, this kind of thing. I think we're at the very early stages of a lot of that, but I do think that there's a lot of potential, and also including incentives for time of use, charging at different times when we have more renewables on the grid that aren't being used, that kind of thing. Actually, ICCT did a study with your, I guess, ex-colleagues at RAP, and we looked specifically at the case of Colorado and kind of how much they could save on infrastructure costs by implementing a lot of smart charging in the future. And I think it was about in less than 10 years from now, I mean, they could be saving easily 100 to 300 million per year. So it was significant. And when you add that up for all of the states, it's a lot. So I do think that that's a technology that's we're going to be seeing a lot more of. And I think it's actually really important that we leverage that.
Yeah, that's great. We've talked a little bit about, you talked about early on, Vali, about ability to pay. And I think that touches on an issue that we've sort of danced around a little bit but haven't addressed directly, which is the equity aspect of affordability or ability to pay. And specifically, it's not just that higher prices, higher costs affect vulnerable populations more, but it also the technologies that can help lower the cost of the electric vehicles, induction stoves, etc., are expensive. Upfront costs are pretty high, and they're harder to disperse. So there's a accessibility issue as well here. I wonder if you have any additional thoughts on what we should be doing to make sure that these technologies, the clean energy transition is not a class transition.
Yeah, no. So I think, specifically since this panel's focused on the U.S., I think one of the things we're seeing is more and more people are income insecure. So that delineation between who's low to moderate income, again, housing, all of the costs we talked about increased. So I think one is that even before you get to an EV or to an induction stove, is increased use of digitalization. Right. So again, there's more and more advanced meters, and even without advanced meters, there are companies like my former company, Oracle, who can text you and say, I get a weekly report that says, this is what you use, this is your estimated bill. I get that sent to my email, and then if it's needed, I will print it out and put it out for my husband and daughter and say, hey, we're making some changes this week. And so I think using that digitalization, which on a per customer basis is relatively low, right? It's very, very low to be able to do that. It's a very low technology lift to integrate it with utilities. I think the other thing that I have preached about, and so this is one of the hills I will die on, is the ability to have people pay their bill either on a weekly basis through non-traditional means. And so typically I say Cash App, but if I get that same email, if I'm income insecure and I'm driving for Lyft or I'm driving or door dashing, if I have $50 and I get the email that says my estimated bill this week is $38, I might pay $38. I don't really have the means to do that in a seamless way right now. And so what we've seen is that through other models, paying for to some extent, but healthcare companies, Boost Phone, people's ability to pay when they have the income reduces arrearages, which ultimately reduces disconnections. And so when you start looking at cost of capital, like that ability to be able to pay more frequently through non-traditional means can actually have again, when we're thinking about operational efficiencies, can have operational efficiencies.
Yeah, that's great. Do either of you have anything to add to that?
So I agree, and there are challenges, both practical, economic, and political. One of the biggest concerns we have in New York, and something we've worked hard to address, is the concern regarding disconnects. Someone not paying their bill and then getting their service disconnected. At the height of the COVID pandemic, we had over 1 million people at risk of being disconnected. We had an arrears management program. We used ratepayer funds, shareholder funds from the utilities, and a little bit of state funding to pay down the majority of the arrears for most of what was accrued during the pandemic and try to set people on a balance where they could move forward more affordably. There are these things called deferred payment plans, where if you run up a high bill, they'll defer the payment, lower your bill, and turn it into an annuity over time, or you pay a little bit of amount on top of what you already use. But again, this kind of structure creates a never-ending story of you run up a debt, you run into a situation, you get a DPA, and it starts over and over and over again. One of the many things that we have been exploring are the idea of prepaid electric. Pay in advance before you consume. But many advocates have argued that this is inappropriate. It's not fair. Everyone should benefit the same way, where they can use their energy before they pay. We look at it as an opportunity to pay before they use, and not a requirement, but an option. But that's something we're trying to figure out how best to implement, if we can implement it at all. That's going to require some investments in billing systems to make that work, and that's going to mean higher rates as a result. So all of this is a delicate balance, but directionally speaking, it comes down to this: the more information a customer has, the more options they have, the better off they can be, and the more affordable we can make their energy. So.
I'm trying to think of what we can talk about. We haven't talked about yet on electrification. And of course, I mean, the one thing that we've been talking a lot about is the cost of the car for the consumer of the car. Not everyone has cars. Not everyone needs a car. We don't necessarily want to make more cars. That's really not the goal. But, electrification can save consumers money in other way. Obviously, if you're doing public transit through electric buses, those could drive down the cost of public transit. And even when you get into the, before this, I was just at a session around, that was all about freight and electrification of freight. That's going to also bring down the cost of freight. So bringing down the cost of all of the goods that are being transported that everyone's using. So that can actually help bring down costs for entire households and everyone. So, thinking about more holistically than just the cost for the person that owns the car, because I know that's, not everyone.
That's true, especially in a city like New York City. That's certainly true, and in many places in the rest of the world, which is actually in the next panel. Heather Thompson from ITDP will be speaking, and they do a lot on urban mobility options that are not personal vehicles. I'm going to look at some of the questions we gotten from the audience. I'll mention, I don't think I said this before, you also have the ability to upvote questions that you think are especially important, relevant, interesting, so feel free to do that. But maybe I'll start with one that we got, which says, while this conversation has primarily focused on tax incentives and market mechanisms, where do you see the role of robust public investment in grid transformation? Maybe we could expand that to infrastructure more generally. Anyone can take that.
I'll take that one. So we in New York have a robust network of municipal utilities. These are basically publicly owned, non-investor owned utilities. We also have the New York Power Authority, one of the largest power authorities in the U.S. What they have in common is that they were both ultimately products of federal action that spurred their creation. This is a World War II era program. The workforce? I'm forgetting the name of it. The WPA, right. And that's that's a transformative moment in American history where for rural electrification, we brought power out of the cities into rural and suburban life. For build public power to be successful, we all have to work together. Local, county, city, state, federal. It's hard to go it alone, right? And to truly make it work, we need to have that level of coordination at all levels within the existing system that we have, right? There are existing rules that limit your ability to create a new utility within an existing utility, right? We'd have to figure out how to make that work. There's promise of something called virtual power plants, the idea of having distributed energy in the form of your car, your rooftop solar working together in a community to create your own grid within a grid. All of these are technically possible. The challenge is the structure. How do you work together? What happens if one of you doesn't pay your bill? These problems are difficult enough when you're dealing with millions of customers, but they're amplified when there's only 10 or 20. So these smaller aggregations come with inherently more risk. But there's potential, but a lot of challenges to overcome.
And just building on that, one of the things that is really important for electric vehicles to be successful is to have that public charging availability. And we've been seeing public charging availability. The business models are actually very favorable more and more, so that there's actually can be profit for the companies that are putting these in place. However, the areas where there's, in the more remote areas, more rural areas, the business cases are not as good. And so it is helpful if, public money can help kind of fill in some of those gaps. So we can make it more accessible for everybody. The other thing that is good is if the government's kind of set an example. So use this. I believe New York City is doing that, have the public vehicles being electric, showing people what's out there, having them seen on the streets, building up the infrastructure, getting the experiences with it, maybe leading some pool procurements, like these kinds of things. I think that's another good place that government can kind of help invest and lead the way.
And a continuation of that is just public buildings. New York is doing some really great work. There's some other cities doing some really great work, DC. But when you think about like the buildings and the emissions and then the sector and the need for the transition in the building sector, I think that's when we talked earlier about like public perception. Buildings is kind of a neutral place to be able to do that, right? It's a little bit harder if people are putting solar panels on top of, or windmills on top of stadiums. That's one that was very controversial. But people love to upgrade public buildings because they walk in, they feel dusty. And so it's a nice way to be able to do that. and bring, again, the public story along.
Yeah, there have been some efforts to make some improvements to public schools, for instance, which I think is like a really resonant thing for people. It's obviously very emotional, and is a great way to improve, sort of the comfort level in the school, and it's very visible to a lot of communities. There's been a upvoted question here on, is there a way to delink the build out of renewable energy from rate increases? If so, how? I'm looking at you.
I feel like you just should have added my name to that. So, yes, there is. You can build it yourself. That's the way to delink it from rate increases, right? The utility structure we have in the United States and pretty much the world is built on a fairly consistent system. If you're going to have the utility build something out, it's going to go into rates, right? You can have a private developer develop it. The way it gets into rates there is through your energy, the energy component of your bill. It's always going to end up in your rates, one way or another. The way the markets are structured, people have to get paid for the infrastructure they build. With renewables, the biggest cost is the upfront cost of building the infrastructure, the wind turbine, the solar. You finance that, and you expect to get paid over time based on how much energy those things are produced. So yes, it's free. You're not using natural gas or oil to generate the electricity, but it costs something to deploy, and that cost must be repaid. And it's usually very prescriptive. There's an entire series of courses you could take on how to figure out and finance these things, but it's never free. So it's always going to end up in the rates, unless you buy it yourself, in which case it came out of your credit card or your mortgage.
I was going to add, I think, one, go on TikTok, right? Like, we are not on, we are not on TikTok at all. And other people are telling those narratives and stories. And so I think, one, kind of creating the narrative on TikTok, and it's not to delink it, but I think one of the things we also don't talk about enough of is the cost of status quo. So what happens if you don't do renewables, if you don't, again, if we build out and go back to gas, or as some people in certain parts of the country believe, we're going back to coal, what is the cost of going back to coal? Like, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about this. These costs are not just here, we're doing this. And so how do you start to actually say there is a do nothing cost that may, in many cases, increase because of the externalities of that we need to talk about.
Yeah. Do you have anything to add on this, Rachel? Plenty of time. Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So the next upvoted question is, from materials through the whole chain of construction to the end product, what needs to be tweaked most to aid affordability, and what is the policy mechanism to support that? Easy question.
I'll start. I talked about supply chain, but I think really looking at the efficiency of the grid, right? And so I don't know, I'm actually trying to collect the numbers, but, and I know some people talked about this earlier this week, but if all of the work that needs to be done in the infrastructure of the grid, some of that work can be handled by just increasing the current efficiency model, right? Like, I liken it to vacuuming your refrigerator coils versus getting a new refrigerator. At some point, you'll still have to replace it, but you can extend that maintenance. And so I think that is something that I heard a lot of developers, regulators, and people say, why are we making these investments when we haven't vacuumed our refrigerator coils yet? And so I think that's an easier way to sell the story to the public. I don't know if it's going to make bills lower, but at least on that long-term basis, it should help significantly.
Any other?
I mean, I'll just sort of reiterate what I was saying before. We are in moving forward into a new stage, right? We've been going for a long time with trying to improve efficiency and not add new capacity onto the grid, and we need to have that mindset change. I think it's so interesting because we've been working on electric vehicles for many, many years. When we start going now, talking to utilities and explaining, like, there's going to be this new demand, how do we prepare for it, how do we, this, it seems like almost a lot newer information. I think there was a little bit of maybe a lag delay there, but now I think getting that way of thinking all the way from upstream all the way to downstream, and having that joint sort of planning together. We work on transportation. We know where the vehicles are going to be. We know where the demand is going to be. They're saying there's people who are, working on all of the different end use sectors. They know where it's going to be. How can we not get that together and do a little bit of smarter and planning ahead and making smarter investments so that we're not doing this in a sort of piecemeal way? And that's what we need to work on, in my view. I don't know if that's a tweak, though. It seems more than that.
A big tweak.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to add on this, Chair Christian?
Yeah, so the biggest disconnect I've seen over the years is there's limited appreciation for why all these investments need to be made in the first place, right? Every single person in this room is contributing through their actions at home and abroad to the grid that we have, right? The more electricity we use, the bigger the grid. The more air conditioning we use, the higher the peak, the bigger the grid. It's a direct response to our actions. When we developed any grid, whether it's New York, Texas, California, you build it to handle the worst case scenario, plus a margin of error. So if everyone is using as much energy as possible, we have to build it to that plus a margin of error. What would happen if we used a little bit less? We wouldn't have to build it so big. We wouldn't have to add as much generation, as much renewables. We didn't need to deploy as much transmission, right? And that's a part of the conversation I often don't hear, but it's a very important part, because the most efficient, cheapest form of energy is the energy you don't use. And if we're more efficient in the energy we do use, we avoid the cost for all this infrastructure that we know is only more expensive than what we had. So.
That seems like a great place to end this first part of our discussion. So please join me in thanking our panelists.